Yes, what you seem to be suggesting is something that we often, I think, in other words maybe, but what we quite often hear is that basically Putin is doing this for domestic reasons, to solidify his own support domestically. However, does this mean that there's no other grand design either for the neighborhood or for even the EU, Europe itself? Is this really for domestic consumption? Tim Snyder, whom Vasyl, I will give you the word in a bit, but Tim Snyder, a great, I think, historian with great knowledge of at the cultural political level, suggested when he came to Globsec in May, and let me quote, "Europe is only taking the first baby steps towards understanding the seriousness of the challenge of social conservatism and Eurasia, the Eurasian Union. It's masked as a trade agreement, but Eurasia in fact represents a cultural, ideological, and political challenge which aims to fragment the European Union into a group of states without common policies, namely that without a common energy policy, which can then be easily manipulated by Russia." He seems to have a much more sort of, a grand geopolitical reading of Putin's designs, rather than, and nobody is probably ready to negate the fact that this is also for domestic consumption. So isn't Putin serious about the neighborhood, what he's doing in Ukraine and elsewhere, and in Georgia? And doesn't he even want to undermine us in the European Union and in NATO potentially? Because as Snyder argues, that this reduction of Europe into just a collection of states would also divorce it from the US and Canada.
Two aspects why I think, even though we don't know what's in the mind, but we can somehow analyze, looking at structures, even if he had it in mind, why he would shoot himself in his own foot and even higher. For one reason, those countries that are supposed to be coming, subordinates in that huge, bigger, greater Russia, they're nervous. Countries that are not really happy to hear that they're not full nations any longer and stuff like that. So that may not help for internal cohesion of whatever he has in mind. Second point is, thanks to Putin, NATO got a shot in the arm. We have been talking about the last years at conferences that NATO's raison d'être, its mission, is somehow under construction. Some folks, like those who were closer to Russia, were still thinking or thought the main reason for NATO is to cope against the aggressor Russia. But then you had the Western elite nation, the United States of America, that was already beyond that mission. I listened to Obama carefully in Berlin at the Siegersäule at that point when he wasn't supposed to speak at the Brandenburg Gate because he wasn't president there. And he said, that was fine, the NATO, the good old NATO, to make the Soviet Union collapse, but now we have to build other bridges. There are new challenges, and I listen to him, and I clearly hear that concept of a global NATO. Now, people like Anne-Marie Slaughter, and you name the whole elite, and the Princeton Project, where they all would reassemble. Ivo Dalda was a huge proponent of global NATO, and global NATO is not only about territorial defense and about good old Europe. It is about a bigger project. You go out of area or out of business, but that's more extreme. And I had a hunch there is already China, the other big elephant, in the room. And so global NATO was intended to really focus not only in the fight on terror, on some other issues and stabilizing states. We still talked about those issues at that time. I guess now nation building has taken some backseat. But from my perspective, and some people were afraid this global NATO could be oriented against China. And now, thanks to Putin, we have a clearer mission now. It will be more difficult for the United States of America to really convince Poland and other countries to not see Russia as an enemy. Actually, in the United States of America, people are now aware of Russia as being not so innocent as some would have had it. I remember the last debate when they mocked Obama's contender. He more or less said Russia is still a threat. Well, people weren't really convinced. They laughed about it. I mean, it didn't help him way back then. Even now, it doesn't help him a lot. So threat perception is an issue, and I think if Putin now wanted to further his own case, to sum it up, he heard it by damaging the inner cohesion and also helping if he sees us as an enemy, and there is some substance there to assume that, then he helped us to get our cohesion back, which we were about to lose.
I think this is the perfect time to hand over to Vasyl, because this conflict has been first and foremost about your own nation. I intended to ask what should be done by all sides, including Ukraine's now fully established legitimate government after both the presidential and the parliamentary elections. If there has been any doubt about legitimacy post-Euromaidan, this has now been erased. But as we talked in the cafeteria, I guess a more urgent even question came up in that, has the West resigned on its responsibility towards on Ukraine, and by extension on its own security? Are we overlooking the implications of the crisis now? Vasyl.
Thank you. Thanks again for invitation, for having me here. I think I'm not the right subject to be asked that question, actually, because it's better to address this question to the Western colleagues or Western politicians. Maybe they know better. But just to comment a little bit on what Andrei proposed, and because the problem of, and you quoted actually Snyder, the problem with Russian proposal towards other nations, towards its neighbors, including Ukraine, is that first to propose actually something, you should have a transnational dimension of the proposition. For example, yesterday after the discussion I was asked by several people, what about Russians in Ukraine? It was really very weird for me, because I just answered, what Russians? What do you mean actually? In which sense Russian? Yeah. And here we come into the crucial point on which I would say ideological basis on which Russia is, because of which Russia is quite active. It is widely used in Russian propaganda that the logic they are following is to protect Russians. They are using actually the term which is in Russian "соотечественники." In English it would be like co-countrymen, or maybe it's no, it's rather co-fatherlanders. So it's like people who somehow are Russian, but in very specific sense, yeah? Because in Russian language you have two terms which mean to be Russian. One is Россиянин, which means like Russian citizenship, like people who have a Russian passport. And the other thing, which was actually widely used by Yeltsin, and the other one is Русский. Yeah, it means totally different. It's not about citizenship. And Russia, I mean, of course not Russian people, but Russian authorities are always saying that they are protecting Russians abroad. In Georgia, in Kazakhstan, maybe also in Ukraine, in Crimea, for example, that was like a pretext for the annexation. But funny thing is that what it means to be Russian, from this point of view, a couple of days ago, the Russian Moscow Orthodox Church passed the document which is called the Declaration of the Russian Identity, which is really very much symptomatic. Because in this sense, to be Russian and to be protected by Russia means that you are Russian when you speak Russian, when you share the common historic experience of previous ages with all the Russians, and that you live on Russian territories. But why these territories are Russian? Like in Crimea, yeah, it's Russian because it's ours, full stop. Yeah. There is no logic. It's just because it's a performative, yeah, it's political performative. It is like that only because it is declared like that. So, and Russia is like trying to impose this kind of logic and to be perceived like a norm by the whole world. Yeah. But it's not effective. That's why they are conducting war. Because maybe, I don't know, maybe they are trying to build some like Russian international, but actually they don't have this transnational, international dimension in this kind of ideology and this kind of alliance they are proposing to its neighbors. Because let's take the West. Yeah? The West, the NATO, EU integration is based on the ideology of the human rights. Yeah? Because, let's put it generally, yeah, that's why they like invaded Afghanistan, they invaded Iraq, to impose human rights. But human rights is the idea of universalism, is a global idea. One can apply this idea to every context. But the idea of co-fatherlanders is an anti-universal idea. It can be applied only to those who define themselves like that. So it's kind of contradictory, and it shows the weakness of Russian position, because it cannot really struggle with the West in general, because it has only the proposal to itself. So here we are also returning to the situation inside Russia. That is, this product is made for Russians, is made for the people who live in Russia. It cannot be shared by other people. Let's keep in mind that they are inventing all this stuff in the context of the counter-revolution, yeah, which is an answer to Maidan revolution. And Maidan is like the biggest nightmare of Putin. Yeah. Everything he makes, I mean, Putin, of course, is not a person. Yeah, it's like a guise of a structure. I'm not, because, you know, we are now like, it's pretty popular in the media to sit and guess what Putin really thinks. It's not about psychology, yeah? I'm talking about structures, the logic of the system. And what we see after Maidan is that Russian authorities are trying to liquidate, to wipe out all the possible consequences of the revolution. Because it's pretty interesting, because they are like in the double bind. Because Russia is the country which inherited the USSR. And USSR, as we all know very well, has a revolutionary beginning, has a revolutionary start. Yeah. And what we see now in Russia is like decaying process of the remains of what was from the very beginning a revolutionary project. Some, maybe Andrei also knows, some oppositional Russian journalists even write that the day of the national unity, which is a national holiday in Russia, the 4th of November, was invented in the presidential administration to take off the light from the 7th of November, the day of the October Revolution. Yeah. So Russian authorities today are trying to wipe out, to take off all the possible revolutionary aspects from the USSR heritage and to radicalize all the conservative, unbelievable monstrosity USSR had. So that is the logic, to be counter-revolutionary in general. And that's why like they use anti-Americanism, anti-Europeanism and anti-Western like strategy in general. It's pretty like surprising that America is present. Yeah. Also in the case of Crimea, in the case of Ukraine, we were talking and I mentioned that just imagine that Putin didn't start the war. And we are organizing in Ukraine a real referendum about NATO. Most of the people would vote against, for sure. Maybe now the position is changed because of the war, because of the position of Russia. So it's like really very strange because NATO wasn't present in Crimea and wouldn't be present for a long time. So it's all about illusions, about the fears that the Kremlin has. It's its problem, it's not ours. But the problem is that the Kremlin is behaving like it's our problem. Yeah? But another point actually is that anti-Americanism is a very useful instrument in Europe because you can like go deep inside the European context to work with. Because when you say, for example, that the US is behind Maidan, so the European position is like, okay, we are out. If America is behind that, we are out. So it's you care. We don't care about Maidan if America is behind. So it's very useful. Putin knows like soft spots, yeah, of the European position, and it uses all of them very successfully.
Well, thank you. We have now come and I will step back after this question as a moderator in favor of bringing the audience in for questions. Tomáš, will we be ready for that after this question? At least one mic you can grab from us. Maybe we can share it then. But I would like to pose all three of you the question of propaganda. I think that's something that, as I said, if nothing else, we've been losing on this front because we have on the other side an authoritarian, ruthless, determined player who has all the instruments of power under his grab. He's determined to use them. He's investing in it, and he has in fact already invaded Europe, if you will, without military means. We, on the other side, are a group of nations. We're not one centralized entity. We operate on the basis of freedom. We do not censor or direct, for that matter, our journalists. We don't create official propaganda stations or channels. And so it's very asymmetric what we are up against. So could you possibly comment on whether you think that we are seriously losing, and maybe Andrei, whether you think Putin is really seriously winning on the one hand, and what can be done about this? Because especially for you, maybe Andrei, I think Putin has basically is what he's also doing in a true Orwellian sense, I think, is that he is even rewriting history. He's putting things in history books into the new generation that is essentially an imperial design. So are we losing the next generation of Russians there? Is it and does it make sense for us to sort of separate the Kremlin on one side with the sanctions and whatever political instruments we have, and perhaps work on the media side vis-a-vis the Russian civil society? And isn't it too late to do that?
Well, I think it's about two questions. It's about propaganda abroad and the propaganda which we have inside of Russia. And in terms of foreign propaganda and propaganda intended on Europe, I think we should remember one thing which we completely disagree with, the ideas of great design of Putin. I think personally that actually the thing which was liked by the Kremlin all the time was a strategy. They are tactical guys, and the foreign policy of Russia was always reactive. They just react to something happens, they react. And it might explain why we have so many strange things happening, like we have the great victory of Russia after Sochi, and then we got this disaster with Crimea when Putin just lost everything he gained it because of Sochi. And that might explain why Putin invested so much efforts into trying to court European Union and trying to present himself as an ally of European Union against the United States. And when he just lost everything, using in his propaganda ideas about that now we should rely on China, that Europe is a weak and degraded country with full of homosexuals, etc., region full of homosexuals, etc., etc. The problem here is not structural, and here I disagree with you, because we should remember of the thing. We should remember of mentality. The problem is that Putin is really from the KGB, and his immediate entourage, they're all from the KGB. And the problem with the KGB is, and this is a big difference, say, between KGB and CIA, that the KGB after Stalin purges and in 60s and 70s and 80s, were not allowed to provide analysis for the party officials. The party was so afraid of the security services of the Soviet Union that these guys on Lubyanka was not allowed to provide analysis. That's why the very first analytical department of the KGB was formed in 1989, just the right time, because the next year the whole of Soviet Union collapsed. These people, they don't know how to think strategically, and this is a big problem for them. Tactically, they might be extremely good, but strategically, it's a different problem. And also, we should remember one thing: when we are talking about propaganda, we tend to believe that it's all intended on outsiders, and people in the Kremlin, they are all shrewd and smart. And people inside of security services, they just manipulate people, etc. What's striking me during Crimea crisis, that people inside of the security services, my contacts inside, they actually believed in this conspiracy theory. And they believed that Putin always goes on offensive. That's a very important part of the Kremlin ideology and mentality, that Putin always goes on offensive, protecting himself, protecting his area of influence, protecting his country, protecting someone else against the offensive of the West, or of the offensive of the United States. And also explains why he always reacts to something, because he believes in these ideas of threats. Something happens, he needs to react. Something happened like Orange revolutions. He needed to find some answer. He failed. He lost some countries. He tried with military means in Georgia. Again, he failed. When Maidan happened, he needed to react, and he needed to find some sort of response. He found this response, this magic tool. He might grab some territory, and this might deter other countries to allow the new Maidan, say, in Belarus to happen. So for him and for his entourage and for people in security services, it's always about defensive things. And that might explain why, when we are talking about, again, it brings me back to your question about propaganda, especially abroad. Of course, Russian propaganda now looks very successful, but we need to look into reasons. Actually, we have this feeling of anti-Americanism in Europe. And this situation was not created by Putin. It's not because of his strategy. It just happens because of many reasons, because of Iraq, because of Afghanistan, because of many things that happen in the Middle East, because of the general feeling of grievance. And Putin just filled this room. He just presents himself as the only tough guy in the room who is able and is willing to challenge the big evil of the world. That's all. He just tried to exploit the situation that was already created, not by him and not by his allies, by someone else. He was extremely lucky because he got Snowden, he got some other guys. He might exploit this feeling that he might unite the oppressed. Unite the oppressed by the West, or by the United States. So for a while, for the period when we have this feeling of anti-Americanism, and when the United States and Europe has nothing to do, not nothing to do, but we just don't know what to do with this, Putin would be successful. In terms of internal propaganda, it's completely different. The problem with internal propaganda is it's not about all the stories about atrocities committed by Ukrainians. Nobody cares about Ukraine, nobody cares about Donbass. The problem is what we should expect at this situation longer before, because the political debate and the political culture, therefore, in Russia was seriously undermined by Putin since 1999, when he decided to pressure all traditional media. When we lost our traditional media and their independence, the middle classes, supposedly the new and advanced part of the society, became disillusioned with journalists. And profession of journalists was largely compromised. And the idea for the middle classes was, well, we don't want to think about politics because all these guys are corrupt. What we have next? We got the Moscow protests and the feeling that, well, the Kremlin is corrupt, we need to do with that. But what happened next? The same people, because of the lack of political culture and political ideas, they also think that the opposition also corrupt. Because if you tend to distrust any kind of politicians, you also distrust opposition politicians. So that's why the ideas of corruptness of, say, Navalny was also widely popular. The next thing that happened, yes, the Moscow protests awakened the middle classes in Russia. But Putin provided to these people the means and the feeling of meaning better than the opposition. Because the opposition provided something about nationalism, something about corruption, but it was not such an appealing idea for them. And now we got this feeling of, well, again, we are a superpower, we can challenge the United States. And given the fact that the political culture is so weak and so degraded, the middle classes accepted this idea very eagerly. Another problem is the problem of security. For the middle classes in Moscow, the problem of security is extremely important. We just need to remember that all these people, they really believe that one day some bloody Maidan might happen, 1917 might be repeated in Moscow, and all these guys with all their cars, with all their apartments just bought, might be just stolen by some Bolsheviks. Or now they would be migrants, or someone else, or might be Americans. But they really believe an idea of a bloody revolution. And this feeling of the fear of revolution was played skillfully by the Kremlin since the time of the Arab Spring. And the Kremlin always sent a message, well, see what's going on in Libya. Do you want the same thing to happen in Moscow? See what's going on in Syria, in Egypt, and now in Ukraine. You see, this is a bloody thing. Do you want these things to happen on the Moscow streets? And I know personally many people who actually went to the streets to support Navalny, who now told me very honestly, yes, Putin is a very bad guy, but I don't want my children to see this kind of bloody Maidan, because we really believe in bloody Maidan, thanks to propaganda. And that's why they decide that we need now, for this period, to support Putin. So Kremlin is very well skillfully playing with this feeling of insecurity.
Vasyl. Propaganda.
Yes, thank you. what I would like to add is, the first lesson that the Kremlin wants us to learn after Maidan is that the war is the next step, what usually happens after the revolution. So it is always in its discourse tries to connect two separate facts, that Maidan leads to war. And everything Kremlin does in Ukraine is concentrated more or less on that idea. So it's like leads us out from the subject which is really responsible. So Russia is always, that's why it's always denying its presence in Crimea, in Donbass. So we are out. We have no soldiers in Ukraine. Some separatists, some like other guys are there. Yeah. But on the other side, I think a lot of propaganda is also based on history, because the ideology of Kremlin is very much in history. Look at the symbols that appeared in the east of Ukraine, in Crimea, during what was called anti-Maidan. It's not by occasion that they took Georgievska ribbon as its symbol, which was like in the USSR the image of the great victory over Hitlerism. So Russia is very much concentrated around the Second World War, the victory over fascism, and on the date of the 9th of May. So here is really very interesting, because Maidan is blamed as being like fascist occupied, Ukraine is blamed as the Fourth Reich, as junta, and so on. But here is the answer, because it comes everything from the history, from the Second World War. Russia is like still acting out. What is in psychoanalysis is called acting out. It plays the same game. It still fights fascists. It is the same discourse. The same discourse it uses for all the years, because the myth of the so-called Great Patriotic War, actually this term was proposed by Stalin. Because for Russia and for Soviet people, it was not the Second World War, it was Great Patriotic War. This is the only myth that overlived, almost with no damages, the crash of the USSR. And this is the basic stone for today's Putin's ideology. It's the horizon which defines like everything. That's why fascists, that's why they are fighting fascists. That's why fascists are in Ukraine, because they have no other terminology. They cannot propose other vocabulary for the enemy. The only thing they have is inherited from the USSR history, and that's why they're exploiting it very much. But on the other hand, it's really funny. Look at the so-called referendums that were held in Crimea, in Donetsk, in Luhansk. Only official representatives from the West they had there, so-called observers from the West that were participating in the referendum, were representatives of the far-right parties, which are supported by the Kremlin. From the Jobbik, Hungary, from National Front, France, from the Freedom Party, Austria, and so on. So on one hand, they are fighting fascists, but on the other hand, they are like building new fascist international in Europe. They are very much supportive towards the neo-Nazi initiatives and parties in Europe. So this kind of dialectics is really very crucial. Just imagine the country which inherited the USSR, which lost like millions and millions of people in the Second World War, is now becoming more and more fascist. Is a country with normalized racism, the country of so-called white wagons, this ethnic cleansing in the public transport. Putin maybe is the most influential politician today of the fascist type. Yeah, the rhetoric he uses, the action he uses is very much like close to even the visuality, the propaganda is very much fascistoid. Yeah, so that's why it's like you have two sides, double bind. Yeah, he uses fascist propaganda, and at the same time, this fascist propaganda says that it is fighting fascists. Yeah. So it's one of the most important aspects to understand why this propaganda is so effective. But on the other hand, as I have said, it's very weak because it has no myth. Yeah. Ukraine now has a myth. It's called Maidan. And Russia doesn't have a myth. It has only history. It's like, it's like ghost, like Hamlet's father, which is visiting constantly the reality.
Yes, Josef. I invite your comment, but please make it succinct. We want also the audience to have questions there. I think the latest, what is being said, is really about the links that the Kremlin and other Kremlin supporters within Russia are cultivating in Europe. Your own country now, surprisingly, shockingly, has the alternative that it hasn't had for years now, that made a showing in your local elections. So propaganda and its links to the European far right, far left, what have you.
I'd like to tackle your basic question whether Russia has a leg up being an authoritative state, having everybody more or less on the same page, and those who are not, they are being, taken away or whatever you do with that. On the first glance, yeah, they may be having a leg up against democracies where you have pluralism, and even people now who say, even in Europe and even in my own country, yeah, Putin was right to do his own stuff. I mean, that's part of democracy. Is that a problem? Should we be as autocratic as Putin is? I would make the other argument. I think ideology, and that's what propaganda is a part of, really has two big problems. One is one day you believe in it yourself, you lack strategic vision. I mean, sometimes I wonder, do they really still think Russia is the biggest enemy to the United States? I got me into big trouble when I asserted that US might be more focused towards China than to Russia. Oh my God, that was a huge problem. And I think many people haven't really gone beyond their Cold War realistic mentality, they call, or their realistic view. So the problem is you have that groupthink. And that groupthink, when there is no checks and balances, no reasoning, no public reasoning, when you don't have a vivid debate where you really argue, that gets you into big trouble. You want a glimpse of it? We also had that groupthink in the freest nation of them all, in America. The Iraq War can only be explained by this concept of groupthink. There were a few decision makers that were not to be compared with Russia and an authoritarian regime, but my point is, if you limit your analysis to a narrow view, and you knock out those who don't agree with you, and then you make stupid decisions, or as Obama now calls it, this was a stupid war. And the Iraq War has also been sold not on strategic reasons. Bush sold it in evangelical terms, in religion. I was analyzing it before, and when he gave his speech preparing the war for Iraq, he would use strong religious language, and it worked. It worked a lot. Those who went to church more often than others would really pick it up. So he created domestic support for that. So not even democracies are free of that kind of, well, in this case we call it religion, in another we call it propaganda. I call it opium for the masses in two cases. So we are not free of that. But by making those choices with limited debate. We make stupid choices. I gave a few indications before why I think Putin reacted, and I agree with you, reactively, not really strategically. I mean, what to do now with Crimea? I mean, he has to deliver now. That's stupid. I mean, if you think a day ahead, I mean, you might realize that wasn't really the smartest of choices. And the same in the US. I mean, this Iraq war really weakened America to an extent that now old ghosts are trying to feel stronger again. So you can even make a case now with the muscle flexing of Russia and even China to the case that America made a stupid decision, a stupid war, and hurt itself, made Iran stronger, you know, took out the main enemy of Iran, which was Iraq. So consequences. When Obama says now our biggest threat are not terrorists, are not rock states, is not China, is not this and that, but our own domestic weakness. And I have to take care to bring our strengths back. When people who know foreign policy very well, like Richard Haas, heading the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States, when they say America has to restore its own strengths, and you know what I'm getting at. So sometimes it's good to be not on the same page, because democracy, pluralism helps you to avoid mistakes. There's no guarantee, but even when in a democracy you limit the debate, you're more prone to commit mistakes. And you could make the same argument for the way an economic system is set up. Guided economies or authoritarian economies are by definition more stupid than the wisdom of us all who make everyday decisions and do it collectively. So here, that's probably my ideology. I still believe in market economies. I mean, doesn't have to be the complete free market, but even on that hunch, I would say rather to have pluralism, to have many more decide than a few guys who decide what's good for the country in the next 5 years. People who don't have really the foresight to do that.
As long as action is taken, right? Rather than paralysis through internal dialogue. I wonder, this microphone, it works to some extent, that's fine. I invite now the audience in. We've been overdue in inviting comments or questions. Who wants to be the icebreaker? There you go.
Okay. Good evening. I would actually have two questions. One would be probably more direct to Mr. Cherepanyn. You mentioned that the idea of protecting the Russians abroad is not as universal as the human rights approach, and is limited only to the so-called Russians abroad. How would you then explain the some sort of pro-Russian sentiment among Europe? I don't know, maybe called pan-Slavism, also in Slovakia. Maybe others could elaborate. And the second part, second question would be, that you mentioned also the sanctions that are imposed over Russia are actually in favor for Putin, who uses them for his domestic explanation of economical disadvantages of Russia currently and decline. But on second hand, he also encourages sort of the neo-nationalism or fascist movements like Jobbik in Hungary, which sort of divides Europe. So is United Europe the only thing that he is really afraid of, or is it something else? Could United Europe, strong United Europe with one voice, be in more danger to Russia than just sanctions? Thank you.
answer what you're comfortable with answering, and then the slack will be picked up by the rest.
Thank you for your questions. I don't think that somehow, maybe historically, Pan-Slavism is connected to the Russian ideology as it was like in the 19th century, in the 20th, at the beginning of the 20th century. But actually, it's rather that there are no Russians abroad. Yeah, there are lots of, but not in the sense that the Kremlin is presenting. So you see, like for example, now in Serbia, they treat Putin like their own president, or the same maybe not the same, but in all the Balkans, yeah, they have pretty big sentiments towards the Kremlin. I think that there is a strong economic background for that, of course, the dependence on Russia, as well as in France. But also it is a strategy to feed the pretty traditional European anti-Americanism. Because somehow in the context of Europe, Putin is presented like an alternative to the main empire of this world, which is the US. So that's why you can see, for example, in Russia, by the pro-Kremlin publishing houses that are publishing left-wing, even radical left literature, authors, books, which are pretty popular, by the way, in the Kremlin. Yeah, it's not by occasion. There is like far-right, which is quite supportive towards the Kremlin, because it's also anti the EU. And stupid left, yeah, which calls itself left, which also supports the Kremlin, because for different reasons, also for historic ones. Yeah. But anyway, it's like the vision that the America is the main enemy, it rules the world, and Russia can be an alternative. Even anti-capitalist alternative, which is really absolutely crazy, because capitalism in Russia is totally horrible. It's actually, it's maybe the not biggest problem Russia has, but as for the United Europe, I don't think that, as we already talked about this Timothy Snyder's idea that like Europe only starts to understand that what Russia really means, proposing Eurasian project or Russian wealth idea. But I don't think that the Kremlin perceives the EU as a serious subject. It's like it's much easier to play with the EU, and much easier to make this game with Crimea, with Donbass, than to face real challenges. Because, you know, the very opposition which is Russia constantly exploding, like we, Russia, against the West, it's really absolutely tricky, because it doesn't mean that because Russia is presenting like that it belongs more to the East, yeah? These connections with China and so on. But it is made in the context when we take realpolitik background for that, in the context of xenophobia against people from the Islamic world, towards people from the Northern Caucasus, in Siberia, against Chinese in Russia, and so on and so on. So I think this easternness of Russia is just the symptom of the feeling they have, that they understand very well that their own position is uncertain, undefined. It's like, you know, after the crash of utopia, they don't know what to do. Yeah. And they're just trying to find a way. they are like in non-place, in like utopia. They have nothing to propose. That's why they are inventing really like very strange ideas that can work only in their own context, not outside.
Maybe I can add two things about sanctions. To be frank, I'm more positive about sanctions. I think well, the problem is that when I spoke to my contacts, and not only in security services, but in ministers and banks, the problem, again, it's the lack of strategy. All of my contacts told me one thing, that sanctions would be lifted in November because Europe is so dependent on oil and gas. So I would be very curious to see what might happen with the same people, say, in January. It might completely change the landscape. Also, we need to remember one thing about this support of Putin. One thing to support Putin when he provides yet another proof of crimes committed by the West, or of some new proof of corruption of the West, etc., etc. These things is easy to support, and completely different is to support Putin when he asks you to trust him, especially when we have such a long history of economic crisis, when the government always betrayed the population. We always have the situation when the government lied to its own population. And we already see these problems, and I remember very well that initially in February and March, people were so happy with Crimea, and already by summer, the same people started to say, well, now I cannot understand why I should pay for this Crimea. I don't need this Crimea. Why I should suffer this cuts on my salaries? And it started to happen already in July. And I think, well, maybe in January the situation might be completely different. It's a thing about sanctions. The things about European Union, I think we should remember one thing. The Russians desperately need to be loved by Europe. We want to be in Europe. It's something about emotions. It was always in tradition of Russia to try to pretend that we are actually a part of Europe. It was a game. We tried to remember 19th century when all Russian elites spoke French, when it was English, and it's still a big issue in Russia. When you can't speak European language, well, it's something about your status. Remember that just 5, maybe 7 years ago, we were so in love with France that we got some novels and some debates after the novel was published about how we need to save France of migrants. It was really ridiculous. We got debates in Russian society, on Russian TV, about Islamists might invade France, and we need to save this France we love from these Muslims. And governors invited with Maria Chudinova offered to Russian regions to give talks about how to save Europe from migrants, because we love Europe as it was in the 19th century. So maybe the problem is that this kind of appeal of Europe to Russia would be for forever. And nobody wants to say to go to China to skiing. Everybody wants to go to Austria. Maybe the problem is that when we see and you see so many Russians on your hotels, you believe that these people understand something about Europe. That's the problem. The problem with these people that we travel to Europe, but we know and understand nothing about Europe. We know it's mostly about the lack of. We are losing media every day. For example, a year ago, in Moscow on cable TV, it was possible to watch MSNBC, CNN, and BBC World Service. Now it's only about CNN. In January, there would be no CNN. So it happens every day. And the problem is that as a result, people just don't know. When we're talking about Europe, we are talking about the 19th century. And we just need to keep it in mind. And it's the same going on with Ukraine. For example, when I try to talk to people who are, brainwashed by propaganda, and for example, after some hours passed, able to convince them, and maybe we need to think differently. Maybe they ask me the same question all the time: Could you just point me to the one media, to the one website in Russian, where I can read something correct and detailed about what's going on in Ukraine? That's the problem. So maybe the problem is very old. It's a lack of information.
Very good, very good. Questions, other questions? I'm told by Tomasz that we can go for another 10 minutes maximum. So whoever feels a burning desire to ask a question, or have we exhausted it? Ourselves and yourself. There you go, gentleman in the back.
Good evening. Thank you for the word. The first question I will ask is about the ideology behind the current Kremlin, because I think it's a synthesis of the traditional collectivism that's embedded in the Russian society. Well, we could look at the parties, for example, KPRF and LDPR. Well, I think Putin is successful in merging those two parties, like their ideas, for example, the militant nationalism of the LDPR and the look at the foreign policy of the KPRF, which is, well, notoriously anti-US. Well, that's the first question. And then I would like to ask about the future of the current Russian ruler, because the Russians I know, they are not really the typical middle class guys. They are more interested in investing in Europe, for example. They are not really happy with current foreign policies of Russian Federation and Putin, because, well, the rubles going down, they are basically losing their power. Aren't they going to, well, let's say, crashing in a few years? And the last question would be about the Ukraine. Isn't Ukraine the prime example of a torn country which is not really civilizationally determined? Because I think, well, first, well, as I perceive it, well, Russia is a different bloc compared to, for example, us as a Europe on the value basis, for example, and Ukraine is something between, because you have a lot of guys who are, well, completely European, and you have a lot of guys in that country which are, well, basically on the value perspective more Russian oriented. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, three of them. On the future of Putin, I don't know, Andrei, do you want to tackle that one? There was talk about this yesterday, right? And there was this. There's this idea around that anything other than Putin might be worse than Putin. And I think that's precisely what the Kremlin would like us to believe, isn't it? If I take it just from a purely propagandist perspective, but the reaction was much more healthy or realistic to that we don't really know, because there's no succession mechanism, there's not even a party to be worth speaking about, and that there's no real opposition in Russia. So the future of Putin and perhaps the and then a perfect question, I think, for Vasyl would be about Ukraine being a torn civilizationally, assuming that East and West applies, and the recent, Putin's policies have done nothing about for their part, have done nothing about that. And the first question, sorry, remind me of that. Sorry. Oh yeah, the now completely overshadowed parties as I see it. Andrei, why don't you tackle the first one?
Well, about the parties, maybe you're right, but I think it's more simple. It's just about these two parties always presented the idea of revanchism, because they were never about communism, and KPRF was very far from communism. It was always very patriotic and nationalist. The same thing with LDPR, and to be frank, for me, sometimes it was very difficult to find the difference between these two parties. So they just, Putin just grabbed this banner of fighting against the United States, and that's why in this way he succeeded, or maybe used their ideas. But the same thing we might say about Limonov, who used to be the opposition politician in Russia, persecuted and sent to jail, but actually he was the first to proclaim these ideas of protecting Russian-speaking people abroad by military means. If you remember, he was sent to jail because he tried to, or maybe he just talked about, organizing a coup d'etat in Kazakhstan, hiring some French mercenaries, and that was really fine, immoral. But anyway, so it was, ideologically, it was very, very close. About Putin and his future, I think that, well, maybe the problem is, I think, is about mechanism. I think you're absolutely right. The opposition now is absolutely destroyed, mostly because these middle classes, which were so supportive for the opposition in 2011 and 12, now are all behind Putin because of this fear of bloody revolution. And so it seems that there is no way for any kind of grass movements to present a real challenge for the authorities. So it brings us back to maybe even 19th or maybe 18th century, so to the ideas of coup d'etat. And that some people in immediate entourage of Putin might decide one day that maybe these sanctions or this strategy might be not very successful for them. And of course, it has nothing to do with democracy. So in this case, I'm a bit pessimistic. The problem also was not. The problem is also about nationalism. What Josef spoke before is. Remember one thing about the opposition parties in Russia. The opposition parties in Russia started to play with nationalism long before Crimea, maybe in 2003, 2005. The idea was that somehow Russian opposition and liberal movements always failed to get public support. And by the mid of 2000s, the leading Russian opposition leaders came to conclusion that maybe the reason was that in the east of Europe, the democratic movements were always supported by nationalists and by nationalist feelings, because the idea that you need to get rid of Russians always might find more support than the ideas of democratic values. And that provokes them to think that now they should play with nationalism. And of course it's absolutely different, because one thing is to try to get rid of superpower which control and have military bases in your country. And completely different thing is to proclaim ideas like Navalny did, we have to get rid of the North Caucasus, or we need to get rid of migrants. But the problem is that now almost all opposition parties in Russia are compromised by this games with nationalism, and it seems they still believe that this should be a way to gain public support, which is not very helpful and optimistic.
Yeah, thank you for your question about Ukraine. It presupposes that we have this famous division or the split of the country on two parts, the west and the east of Ukraine. Actually, this idea emerged, as far as I remember, even before the Orange Revolution, before 2004, and was pretty often used at the elections during former Ukrainian President Kuchma before the first Maidan, which was, the idea was that Ukrainians are of three sorts. Yeah. And the central one, like central western one, second sort is in the east, and like the third one, the worst one, is southeast. And by the way, here you can see the roots of the idea of Novorossiya, yeah, where it comes from. So it's pretty old, like political ideology, technology, which was used in Ukraine, but also used by Kremlin. Yeah, that it always tries to present that Ukraine is split, it cannot be united, and the logic of the events after Maidan was also like following this idea. What I would say here is that actually there are lots of differences between different regions in Ukraine, of course, like in every country. You can have a look at Italy or France, Belgium, like Spain, Switzerland, like almost every country. But there is a very important moment that when Russia tries to present Ukraine as so different inside, full of separatists in the east and southeast, it always imposes or transfers the problem of Russia itself. It's the Russian problem that it's too diverse, full of potentially separatists and terrorists, that identity of Vladivostok is different from the identity of Siberia, and Rostov is different from St. Petersburg, and so on and so on. So what the game in the east of Ukraine, which is played by the Kremlin, is because of having no answer to the Russian problem itself, which they have inside the Russian Federation. But as for the Ukrainian diversity, all the regions were treated more or less the same badly during previous regimes. So there is no specificity of Donbass, for example. Yeah, when the same need Donbass has, the same need has also north of Ukraine, Kharkov, Lviv, Odessa, Poltava, and so on and so on. So the only specificity of this region is that Yanukovych and the Party of Regions, which was the ruling party in Ukraine before Maidan, originally came from Donbass. And Donbass was exploited constantly during Yanukovych's presidency, much more than other regions of Ukraine. And that's why it became so weak. That's why Russia could use this possibility to occupy, to grasp this part of the country. Pretty small one, it's not the whole Donbass, of course. Because of the context, or because of the pretext that was already present and existed because of the neo-feudal oligarchy that ruled in Ukraine before.
Thank you very much. We were taken a little bit by in choreography. That's why my attention was to Josef. I would ask Josef then to make perhaps the last comment of this discussion now. I see nodding there before wrapping up. Josef, the floor is yours.
Actually, two comments, if I may, because there's still one question hanging there. I mean, you said a little bit higher than, let's say, middle class. You're fine with calling those guys elite? Yeah, but people that are worried about their money and their investments, if I understood you right.
Well, in Europe, we would call them the entrepreneurs.
Okay, let's call them entrepreneurs. We'll look at autocracies in our yearbook, not only Russia, but autocracies Germany is dealing with. We conceptualize 3 pillars of stability of autocracies, and those pillars can also crumble. First one is legitimization. Economic output, social welfare, what do you have there? And also security, providing security. because otherwise those entrepreneurs would be really worried about, what you said. Or if you don't provide, let's say, economic output, opium for the masses stuff. And so we talked about a lot, about that pillar a lot. Second one you mentioned is the regime able to co-opt, and I still call them elites, entrepreneurs, possible competing power centers? You need resources to get them in so they don't become opposition. The third pillar is those you have already lost, make sure they are quiet. That's a repression pillar. And those pillars are also interacting. One thing we have not yet talked about, but we probably may have to be talking about that in future discussions, how is the international environment? And that brings me to what Europe could do, but also the broader environment. We haven't talked much about what the US is doing in Iran right now. Believe me, Russian elites are very worried about an approachment between Iran and the US. If they can cut a deal, the Iran oil minister already said we are ready to pump it out for $20 a barrel. And you know what's happening when they hear that in the Kremlin. They're not really willing to work with the West to solve that question. Maybe that could have something to do with the Crimea. The military guys probably know a lot more about Sevastopol and those areas, and where you can also influence the oil price in the Middle East. You can deliver weapons and all that stuff. So that thought struck me at one point. So it's sometimes also about hard power and to change conditions in your environment that could destabilize your regime. Because when the oil price really goes down or stays down, you're in trouble. Because then you cannot really put stability in none of those pillars I've called. So Europe, that's a big question. We have been going around the question it's difficult to tackle, but let me put even more emphasis on it. I think it's our problem, our European problem, and even especially my country's problem. Since many people look at Berlin, what are you going to do? If the Poles got nervous that we do too little, and that was before the Crimea crisis, then we really maybe thinking about doing something. So I'm not suggesting that we can do it on our own, but what I'm saying here is don't expect too much from the Western lead power, from the United States of America. They made it clear, more or less, on the NATO summit. We talked about that before. Reassuring of NATO members, but as I understood it, Ukraine is not really member of that club, and to reset relations with Russia, you kind of gave up that notion, and so we have to think about it, and we have to think probably not in military terms, because military is not really our strongest suit, so we probably should think about how we can stabilize Ukraine. Talking about economic stability, and is it really a smart choice to make Ukraine choose between two areas? I'm a free, a liberal internationalist also in economic terms. I don't believe in regional trade blocks. The way I don't believe in Trans-Pacific partnership in Asia to fight it out with China. I don't believe in TTIP for the same reasons. I believe in multilateral trade. And maybe that's a wild idea, but the German economy is already pushing it. Maybe we open up the trade space and don't give Putin pretexts. They want to go after him. Invite him to trade freely. Invite him to trade freely. So forget about the carrot, the stick we don't have here in Europe. Let's have free trade, a carrot. Invite him to open up and let his countrymen decide which system they want to choose. I'm sure that also scares the heck out of him. But we wouldn't be accused of trying to go after Russia and couldn't be instrumentalized. Maybe a free trading bloc from Vladivostok until around the world or whatever is probably better than just push the EU to enlarge or to do whatever, because that's too optimistic. I mean, look at the debates we have within the EU. I mean, people don't really talk seriously about enlarging. I mean, we have to keep what we have together. We have already opposition parties in each of the countries, right-wing parties. Not in Germany, I wouldn't call them right-wing parties, but they are anti-Euro, and that will be growing. So let's be realistic about our own strengths. Militarily, we can't do a lot without the United States, but here I'm pessimistic. They pretty much made it clear that there's not much to be risked here because it's too far away from us. And the other one is economically. I think we have to play it smarter than just think in little clubs. But that's just one idea. I'm not speaking on behalf of my country. That's just a wild guess. I guess it's probably up to you to figure out what you want for yourself, because only then you can.
Yes, yes. I guess what we have more in our control is really EU and EU enlargement and and the relationship with Ukraine, which is I think central to this whole thing. So for all those who call for a strategy on Russia, I would add that we are in serious dire need of a strategy on Ukraine itself, a self-standing one, and of course there we can't do without Ukraine itself, without its civil society and without its legitimate government that's just formed here. Anything, one or two sentences to add from your part? If not, I would thank you very much, Andrei, Vasyl, Josef, for coming and joining the panel. For my part, a great pleasure and honor for the Globsec and the Strategy Council to be a part of this wonderful Central European Forum. And thank you for coming and staying so late over the weekend with us. There is the Belarus Theater coming up next. So for all of you, you are cordially invited to enjoy a wonderful experience with the theater. Thanks again. And congratulations to everyone on the 17th of November and on the freedom that we all acquired in 1989. Thank you very much.